My name is Jordan Weaver.
And I'm Lacey Weaver. Thanks so much for joining us. The first thing that we want you to do is to take out your phone and download the Shiloh Ranch Church app.
You're going to hear a lot of moving pieces, YouTube channel, 1017 Project. There's going to be a lot of things mentioned, but ultimately our goal is to start moving people towards biblical literacy, the gospel of Jesus, who he says he is in his word, what his word means, and what that means for us. And so with everything else that you're going to have going on around you, ultimately our goal would be that you understand Jesus on a deeper level based on what his word says.
Okay, so welcome. Live, we got live. I'm trying to go through the checklist, because I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. If you're listening on Monday night, welcome. This is a crazy time that we live in 2019, because Wickenburg, our friends at Adel, the online church, our couch church, we're all in the same place. Think of this. We're all in the same place, all at different times. How crazy is that? We all get to be together in the same place, but at different times. I still, there are times, I haven't got it all sorted out in my mind how to feel about that yet. But we are wrapping up a series, and it's a typical Jordan Weaver type series. It's 2 weeks. It's a short series. We started it last week. How many of you guys this week have sort of pondered? I hate that word pondered because there's so much pretense attached to it, but I just thought about it, just considered the idea of acceptance versus approval. Has anybody like this week, I catch myself this week going like, wait a minute, I think what I thought that I wanted was acceptance, but I don't want acceptance. I want approval. I want to be preferred. I don't want to just be allowed to come in and get in the corner. You're fine, you can come in, but we don't care if you're here or not. But approval is like, hey, we're glad, we want you here. We would rather you be here than not. And that's what God offers us. And it's funny because if we're not careful, we start to pursue approval without even realizing it. As people, we all want approval. We say the word acceptance a lot. That's not enough. We want approval. We as people, we want approval. And that's been on my mind this week. And it was, as we look back to the text from last week, that's what we see that Saul's issues, his beginning to end issues is that he was constantly seeking approval. I said it last week. I want to say it real quick again before we get started. There's no quicker way to be generally disliked, just generally disliked, than to be the person who is constantly like, please like me. It's too much pressure. It's too much pressure to have someone go, please like me. And I'm like, I don't know what's happening, but I instantly am liking you less. It's like when we just are so desperate for approval. We're just desperate for approval. We don't understand the concept of God's approval, and so we look for it from people. Then what happens is like we hug approval too tightly and we kill it. It's like our pet approval, and we have to have it so much that eventually we lose approval. Okay, real quick. The series starts in 1 Samuel 28 last week. I'm reading it again if it sounds familiar. Saul has just been told by Samuel. Saul's like, I feel like a loser. And Samuel's like, you are one. He's like, I don't think it's going to get any better. And Samuel's like, I want to reconfirm. It is not going to get any better. In fact, tomorrow, that's it. It's over. And Saul's like, no, I just really, really, really feel like this rejection that I have feared my whole life. I feel like I'm facing rejection. And Samuel's like, yes. Verse 20, 1 Samuel 28, verse 20 says, Saul fell full length on the ground, paralyzed with fear. It says fright. Paralyzed with fear because of Samuel's words. He was faint with hunger, for he had eaten nothing all day and night. So what we see is Saul, this guy that was head and shoulders above everyone else, this king. He was the king. He was the most powerful person in the nation of Israel. He was this guy that had been given Willy Wonka's golden ticket in life. He had just been handed him this opportunity, and as a result, what happens is he messes it up so badly that it's taken from him, and what we find is here's this guy that once stood head and shoulders above everyone, laying paralyzed on the floor in fear. It had ended very badly. It's not going to be a brimstone and hellfire sermon. But how many times, and so much of this, we got to recap before we go further, but how many times we're afraid as young people, we're afraid like, what if I don't get my opportunity? What if I don't get my opportunity? What's worse than that is being a little bit older and going, I think I already had mine and I think I messed it up. How many times in your life have you said, I only wish I knew then what I know now? What Saul is learning is that human approval alone is never enough. Have you ever known somebody that's very, very wealthy, has a lot of money in the bank account? They might even have like a comma in his bank account? Have you ever asked that guy that's wealthy, like an actual wealthy person, how much money is enough? You're only going to get two answers. One is going to be, it's just money. I don't draw my approval from that. So any money is enough. And the other answer is going to be, I don't know, I'll tell you when I get there. The same is true of human approval. Approval from others, we want to be liked. It's why we wear the clothes that we wear. It's why we say the things that we say. It's why we behave the way that we behave. It's like it's wired into us to constantly be looking for a tribe or looking for approval from our group. We don't just want approval, we want approval from things that we ourselves approve of. And so what Saul had was a life of pursuing this approval, and no amount of it was ever enough. He became the king, and it still wasn't enough. Saul's greatest fear was a fear of rejection. King Saul. Have you ever known somebody that's in a really powerful position, but they don't wear it well because they're so small on the inside? Saul was the king, and he didn't wear it well. And his greatest fear was rejection, and now he's facing rejection. What started with Saul as a full-blown character flaw. We can tolerate character flaws. We just do. We all do. I know you guys tolerate some of mine. Some of you tolerate some of mine. But what started as a character flaw grew like a wildfire. It grew. It started as a little campfire that was containable and manageable. It was willful. Saul had this willful need for approval. He didn't just want God's approval. He wanted approval of everybody else. And it was this campfire, and he didn't recognize the danger. And what we're seeing is Saul is laying on the floor, is this little campfire had become a full-blown forest fire, and it was no longer under Saul's control. Would you agree or disagree that Saul had now traveled through what we would call just this disintegration of his personality? His personality was fragmenting and falling apart. And you go, well, why are you telling us about this king that lived thousands of years ago? Because what he fell into, we still fall into. You don't have to be the king of Israel for this concept to be true in your life, no matter how high or how low you see yourself as being on the totem pole. Everybody that walks in has the potential to tolerate a character flaw and see it in their lifetime grow into a forest fire that cannot be controlled. What do you think addiction is? Addiction is this little thing that maybe we don't approve of, but somewhere it changes, and maybe we're not exactly sure of the process or that it's happening. But if you ever known someone in addiction, it is so easy to see that their personality in addiction becomes disintegrated. Some of this won't make sense to some of you because some of you don't have close relationships with people in addiction. Others who do will know exactly what I'm saying right now. That addiction takes the person and puts them in a little box and shoves them into the corner, and the addiction starts to take over. And what we see in Saul is exactly those type of symptoms. What if, and this is probably a sermon for a different day, but what if that's what hell is? What if hell is just God's ultimate willingness to go, okay, that's the direction that you've chosen, and the disintegration never stops? I mean, the idea of hell being scary because of fire, I mean, sure, I get it, but the idea that, have you ever known anybody that's so lost in addiction that they've lost themselves altogether, and it's like they no longer have an addiction, they have become the addiction, that who they are is now the addiction? You don't even, in their eyes, you don't even see them in there anymore. That ultimately that God says, okay, I'm gonna give you what you choose, and that for eternity. See, and from zero to 70 years old, we see how badly that can go. Imagine that continuing forever. I mean, to me, that almost seems worse than what we would understand hell to be. 1 Samuel 16, let's go back. Because now we're going to look at David, because David was purposefully placed in this story as a distinction. We see Saul, and if we study Saul long enough, we need to also begin to look at David and go, okay, if Saul is this way and David is that way, David was going to bring the healing that Saul had, for the pain that Saul had caused. 1 Samuel 16, Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. Samuel comes to Jesse's house and he goes, good news, the king is going to be in this family. And Jesse goes, no kidding, great. I mean, you have to imagine if your son's the king, there's got to be some sort of residual benefit in that. Cool. I said it last week, and I'm going to say it again. It's not proven in the Bible, so asterisk next to what I'm saying. But there is this theory that potentially David was illegitimate, that he was sort of an embarrassment on his family, so much so that maybe Jesse didn't even necessarily want everybody to know about David's existence, that maybe David represented a failure in Jesse's life. Now, let's say that's not true. For some reason, Jesse pulls in all of his sons, all of them. Well, Samuel, here they are. It's got to be one of these. All of his sons passed before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, let me prove the point. Are you, this is it? This is all the sons that you've got? That's how interested Jesse was in bringing David in. You want to talk about a lack of approval. So much of your concept of approval comes from your father. And if you're like, uh-oh, bad dad, listen, it's fixable. Can you imagine David? He said, this is Jesse. This is his father. Yeah. I mean, they're still the youngest, and he's tending sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. Verse 12, in walks David. Nobody wants it to be David. Don't you think if you're one of the seven, you're like, just come back over again. Let's just see. So he sent for him, had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. Verse 13. Can you imagine this moment? I'm setting the scene on purpose because of where we're going next. On purpose, the seriousness in the room of like, uh-oh. Because if this is Jesse and you didn't bring David in, don't you think that you're kind of like, uh-oh, now the one that I've treated the worst is going to be the one with the most power. Where were you? I was going to bring you in. That's crazy. You were missing. We couldn't find you. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. Samuel then went to Ramah. Now, this is my favorite part of this story because Samuel's like, okay, all right, it's this big moment. Like, okay, God's going a new direction. Now, keep in mind, that means the lineage of Saul would also have been rejected. The legacy of someone who always is looking for approval suffered for it. Your family will suffer if you are an approval seeker and you don't understand the nature of God's approval. Sidebar, back to David. Anointed, he's going to be the king. Here we go. He's got oil on his head. Okay. Samuel leaves. Now, I know this is a spiritual moment. It would have been a heavy moment, but David's like, well, now what do I do? Well, I don't know. What were you doing? I was tending sheep. Well, king. They're not going to tend themselves. And you see David the next moment. Now, just a practical question. Do you wash it off? Are you allowed to, I'm not saying that to be funny. They're just things that the Bible doesn't cover. Like, he's like, well, okay, the moment's over. I'm going to wash this off, or are you required to wear it? Oil, back to the sheep fields. And don't you think he walked back out? He's probably sitting on his same little rock, watching the same little group of sheep, but now you're processing, huh? Like, hey, what was going on at the house? I think, put yourself in this situation. Like, it's a funny situation in and of itself. Like, wouldn't you have loved to just been in David's thoughts? To be like, hey, you look different. Yeah, I guess you could say I do. Question one. Here's question one. David sitting on this rock trying to wrap his mind, as we all would, wrap his mind around like, Because the Bible will tell us that David doesn't actually become king for a long time. Like you can tell the sheep, come back, King David commands you. Like what? Here's the question. Here's question one. Question one. If you're taking notes, question one. Who required that God choose David? You're thinking, like, this sounds like a very simple question. It is. It's intentionally simple, but who required that God choose David? Now, we would understand that the concept of God would say no one would have required that God choose David. So therefore, the only plausible answer would be God chose David because God wanted David. Simple. It's simple. And you're like, oh, you're hoping for something deeper. Well, hold on. If you're David and you're sitting there pondering, like, why me? No one pressured him. No one went to God and was like, God, listen, we've gotten together, and from an optics standpoint, we feel like it's a good season right now for like Shepherd. It's going to play great in the ratings. God David, that's the one I want. And David, at some point, here, the entire future of the success of David hinged on the fact that as he pondered and he considers, that word again, I'm very philosophical this morning. As he thought about God choosing him, it says that the success of David hinged on this. And this is for you this morning. This is for you. You're not a king. No one else there will never be one of those in this room. We're just blue collar. We're more like the sheep than the king. But this is true in your life in the same way that it's true in David's life. Is David is sitting there going, why me? Why me? His success hinged on the fact that he just believed that truth. Thank you, all three of you, of the hundreds of in the room. It's fine, I'm fine. I'm kidding. David accepted, God chose me. And God didn't have to. All the success that we will see David experience from that truth forward comes from his acceptance of that truth. Now, here's what's crazy. Saul had that same experience, but he could never accept it. He could never come to terms with the fact that he was experiencing the approval of God. Okay, 1 Samuel 18, now we've got David. He's killed the giant because that's just, it's just David. It says he's going to marry Saul's daughter. And Saul is now starting to see the writing on the wall that, hey, wait a minute, because what does Saul want? Approval. And what is David getting? Approval. So he says, okay, I'll tell you what, you can marry my daughter, but you have to bring me proof of death. Is that a PG way of saying what I'm about to say? Proof of death of 200 of the enemy soldiers. And David's like, great. So he does. He does it. David brought them to the king that he might become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave him his daughter for a wife. When Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved him, listen. This is where we're going this morning. Saul was even more afraid because what's the functioning emotion of Saul through the whole Bible? Fear. Fear. We're going to come back to this. You're going to hear it again this morning. Fear. Saul was driven by fear of rejection, fear of disapproval, fear. And so because he was afraid of David, it says this, so he hated David always. That's where it started. Now, question number 2, and this is going to seem really easy. It seems easy, and it is, but it shapes where we're going. Why would David be so hated by Saul? The simple answer would be jealousy. That's an easy one. He would eventually replace Saul. Yeah, we kind of see that. We understand that would be the case. It seemed like Saul just kind of hated everyone. Those are all simple answers, but it goes deeper than that. In fact, I think if we can grasp why Saul hated David, we can identify it in our own lives. We can avoid it in our own lives. We can begin to live more like David than Saul, that we're going to quit destroying our legacies. We're going to quit ruining relationships around us. We're going to see people be built up when they're in our presence. We're going to start loving people. We're going to stop fearing. We're going to start operating more in love. So how big of a question is this? I would say pretty big. If you're taking notes, hey, if you guys want to take notes, do. Here's why. Because by Monday, people are like, what'd Jordan preach about? You're like, Don't say it doesn't happen. It does. But we'll put it on YouTube. Okay. Now we're gonna have to go from like auto function in your brain where you're sitting here thinking about what's for lunch. Take that brain, turn it off. You're gonna have to go into conscious thought or you're gonna miss what I'm about to say. For instance, if I say 5, 6, 7, add one number to each one of those. See what just happened? You went, okay, now I'm gonna have to actually think about that. See? That's the brain I'm talking about. Listen to this. Saul was no longer facing rejection. By the time David showed up, Saul was no longer facing rejection. Saul had started to become the rejection. He was no longer facing rejection. He had started to become rejection. Let me explain what I'm talking about. There was a soldier on a podcast this week I was listening to. Surprisingly, I'm not a doctor. Let me just give you the layman's terms so you'll understand what I'm talking about. He said that he was struggling with PTSD. And I'm going to give you the basics. It's a general oversight. If you want to do your own research, it is an interesting study. But that fear resides in your limbic system, and this amygdala fires in your brain. Please don't get lost in the details, but hear this part. He said that you've got two functions of your brain. You've got auto function, like involuntary, like when you're driving and you're talking to somebody, your first brain is actually the one like in control of the vehicle, even though you're talking and carrying on a conversation. You're able to function in an unaware state. Is everybody with me? But then when you get ready to pass somebody, what happens? Everybody in the car goes quiet. I'm reading a book right now that's explaining some of this. It is fascinating. Everybody in the car goes quiet. And the reason they go quiet is they know for a fact you won't hear them anyway because you've gone into conscious thought because you're having to pay attention to get around the car in front of you. Is everybody with me understanding this so far? First brain, second brain. So he was saying that he had gone to a doctor, and I wrote it down because I want to make sure that I'm explaining it better than what my words would. He said he had lived for so long in fight or flight mode, meaning his secondary conscious thinking had justified being afraid and being aware he'd been a soldier in a battle. And for so long, the natural reaction was self-preservation and fear. And he was in operation mode so much, listen to this, so much consciously that biologically, scientifically, in his brain, it had transferred from secondary reaction to fight or flight. His brain had started growing new nerve endings to the point that his reaction was no longer a conscious action, but it had relocated in the brain from aware thought to basic involuntary motor function. Now, am I making sense here? That he was operating, it's almost like sleepwalking. His PTSD had transferred to where he had lived so long in a state of fear that it was now running his brain without the voluntary function. Now, that set aside, let's go back to Saul. What have we seen Saul from day one? Saul has been in fear. He's been in fear of rejection, fear someone's going to get his place. You know that stinginess, you ever know stingy people? Stinginess is a demonstration of what? Greed? No. Greed is a demonstration of fear. Fear is the cause of me over you, me versus you. I have to protect me even if it costs you. That's what fear is. The nature of the enemy is fear. And Saul had lived for so long in fear that it says that now it was no longer the secondary function. He was no longer having to think about it. It was no longer a campfire that he was managing. His fear was now a full-blown forest fire that he was no longer managing. Is everybody with me? It had now started to become Saul's identity. Now, here's what's crazy. You go to Proverbs 23:7, it says this, "For as a man thinks in his heart, so is he." You ever heard that verse? That if you stay on something long enough, it begins to transition from a choice to an involuntary motor function. That you start to become the choices you've made. When you walk out of this room today, you begin to make choices, and those choices become your character and they become your function. You don't have to be the king of Israel to understand that your choices will become your involuntary motor function. When you are fearful, when you're selfish, when you don't trust people and you become jaded, it's not long until you don't even have to think about those things. You just are. So Saul and David weren't just different. To their core, they were fundamentally opposite. Let me explain what I mean. 1 Samuel 24 says that David is running. Now listen, Everything in the Bible indicates that David was a superior soldier. David, the reason that David was so loved is he was this blue-collar shepherd that was just dirty tough. He was this phenomenal soldier. He was this great leader. And Saul probably had this perception of he's the leader, but he doesn't really get us. You ever had a boss like this that never comes out of his office and doesn't understand how things work in the real world? That was kind of the perception of Saul. And it says that David, by choice, listen, by choice, secondary function, by choice, chose to run from Saul rather than confront Saul. So you have Saul saying, this is my throne, you can't have it. And you've got David saying, that's not my throne, I will not take it. Not until God himself dictates that it's my turn. See the difference? Saul's saying, it's mine, and God goes, no, it's not. And David goes, it's yours, not mine. What you're seeing is that David, because David could functionally accept that he was loved and approved of, he began to exhibit love. His love was so much so active in his life that he became this function of outward thinking. Because fear says, me at the expense of you. Love says, you at the expense of me. Jesus said, you at the expense of me. See, we always think that love and hate, we've said this before, but we always think that love and hate are like the opposite. But teenagers, if you've ever had an ex-girlfriend that says she hates you, she probably still loves you. Because love and hate, they're not as far apart as we think. Love, on one end of the spectrum, the other end is fear. Love and fear are the opposites. So David is running from Saul, and he's saying, I'm not going to take something from you that God didn't give me. And it says that Saul walks into the cave, and Dave cuts off a piece of his robe without Saul knowing it, and Saul leaves the cave. They're in the cave, and the men told David, said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut a corner off of Saul's robe. So he had a moment. He doesn't kill Saul. He takes a piece of his robe. Verse 5, you want to see what love does in moments of pressure? It says, afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, see, you got Saul like, mine, it's mine. It's mine. I find approval because of my throne and because of my crown, and you can't have it because if I don't have approval, then I'm nothing. And David goes, I don't need the throne to feel approval. I got approval in a sheep field. I got approval while I was sacking groceries. I got an approval while I was cleaning the floors. I got an approval while I was loving my kids. I found approval in moments where nobody even knew I existed. I found my approval. I don't need a throne to validate that. How many times do you feel the enemy torturing you over, well, if you're a little more important, if you're a little more wealthy, well, if you had what that person had, well, if you could just get what that person had, well, if you just had this many followers, well, if you just had this big. And David's going, I had all this before I ever started. I honestly believe if David would have never left the sheep fields, he would have died a happy person. And Saul could have become the king of every kingdom and still not been happy. Love and fear share the same biological qualities. Not a doctor. I clarify that just because I feel like I should. I don't think anybody would assume that I was. Given enough discipline and time. So discipline and time. When you can consciously commit to love over fear, to loving God more than you love yourself, to the approval that God gives you, even if you go, I don't feel it. When you give it enough discipline and give it enough time, they both begin to shape our brains and become more and more involuntary. You can do your own research. Back to the question, who required God to choose David? Nobody. It boils down to the fact that God just chose David because God chose David. God approved of David. God just saw fit to elevate David to a position he couldn't have earned for himself, and David accepted that. And because David accepted that, his life improved. The lives of those around him improved. And because Saul would not accept that, his life fell apart now. Let me ask you a question. Who required God to love you? See, it's not that foreign. It's not that foreign of a concept. Well, David, he became king. Let me tell you, the love of God is more important than being the king of Israel. I mean, it's that God loved you speaks to this mercy, this unwarranted, this unearned favor that you have from God that you can't even explain. Who was going to hold God's feet to the fire? I listened to a sermon by R.C. Sproul this week, and it said, if God sent every human on earth to hell, the only accusation we could make is that God is just. But if he doesn't, and he chose instead to love us, that means that God is good and God is merciful, but you can't hold his feet to the fire and go, you have to love me. That's what Saul did. And his life fell apart, and he was miserable, and he was hateful, and he was fearful, and he eventually became fear. David considered God's approval and went, well, then what else do I need? Can you imagine a life where you could consider God's approval and think to yourself, then what else is there? I've got goals. I've got things I want to accomplish. I've got places I want to go. I've got things, but at the end of the day, my secondary conscious, me passing the car instead of me just driving the car goes, wait a minute, then consciously, then God's approval should mean more to me than it does. God's approval is quite literally life today and tomorrow and the next day and for the rest of my life. If I can live out of a place of approval instead of a place of striving, my life will be better for it and your life will be better for it. Even if you would say that, well, I'm just a sheep herder kind of person, that doesn't disqualify you. Well, I don't have a lot of money. Well, my job isn't important. See what I mean? It falls through all the cracks until it eventually even gets to people like you and me. God, what did I do? Try to answer that. God, what did I do that you love me? Work through that for a while. Because if you think about it long enough, what you'll come to is, God, what did I do that you love me? And what you're going to find is nothing. Nothing. You didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it. And if you've got it, then you should live out of it, not for it. Can I explain that? That you should live your life out of this approval that you didn't earn, rather than trying to earn approval that is not yours anyway. You'll never get people's approval. Fastest way to lose people's approval is to try to get it. You can do life and then look for approval. You ever know anybody like this? You pull off something, you get something accomplished, and you're like, anybody? Oh, man, that was not easy. It may have looked that way. My grandpa, God love my grandpa, and he's in heaven, so he's healed. But we'd be roping, and he was like 700 years old, and he would be like, get off that horse. I knew it was coming. My wife is laughing. She was there. He'd lope his horse, because technically he owned the horses when they were babies, and then I trained them, which means, they're his. He loaded this horse up and just stop and jump off. I'm not exaggerating. I swear to you, I am not making this up. He was 80 years old. He'd stop his horse and just jump off of him. I'm as confused as you are. Just jump off. Just jump off, and then he'd do this. See that? This is my grandfather. And people were trying to be impressed, but they weren't sure. They were like, whoa, yeah. Whoa, do you guys see that? Can you tell me why that's important? I catch myself, though, as much as I hated that, because even the horses are like, eh. My father-in-law's laughing. He was there for it, too. Not one word of that is a lie or an exaggeration. That's exactly like, get off that horse. Okay, here it comes. But I catch myself sometimes doing something, being kind to somebody that was mean to me, and I'm like, do you see that? Oh, man, whoa. Look at the grace. You ever have somebody do something and not, like you've done something and then somebody else, I know this means that we're petty. I know that it does. Can we just please get over our righteousness for a second? Do you ever have a moment where something happens and you don't get the credit for it that you deserve? And you're like, I don't care. I don't even care. But deep down, you're like, would it kill you? What you see in Saul is this king that was constantly bailing off his weird horse and going, why doesn't everybody approve of me? And people are like, we don't care. And then you've got David, and David's going, I've already got the approval. Here, you ride the horse. You go for it. You do it. Let me help you. I'm good. I've got my approval. I know where I stand. I was a sheep herder, and now I'm a king. I didn't have any control over that. How can I help you? If God did that for me, what can I do for you? Do you see the difference? And what happened? People loved David, and they hated Saul. It's a life hack that says it's not. Now listen, I want to clarify. I said it last week, and I need to repeat it because if you didn't catch it, if you're one of those people that I don't need people's approval, you're a psychopath or a liar, one or the other. Everybody likes approval. Everybody likes approval. There's nobody who doesn't like approval. And maybe you don't like approval from people you don't like, but that doesn't disqualify you from being someone who likes approval. Everybody likes approval. It just can't be your primary function. When you get to a place where you accept this approval from God in light of who God is, and then you try to, why does God like me? Hey, listen, you may not even be the best Christian in your house. You might be the worst Christian that you know. You might literally do everything wrong. But you have to come to terms with this. Why does God love me? Why did God approve of me? What did I do? Nothing. But you got it. So if you got it, why not turn around and use it too? Because remember, fear says, I have to have it even if it costs you something. Love says, you take it, I've got plenty. Saul would do life and then look for approval. David, he would do life because he's already been approved. One is based in fear. One is based in love. One starts as a choice and becomes a habit. The other starts as a choice, becomes a habit. Let's pray. Lord, help us to understand it's a concept bigger than ourselves. It is. It's bigger than us. But Lord, we all have been through it. We all know what it's like to need approval. It's just woven into us to look around for approval and desire approval and want to be liked or want to be loved. God, it's just in us. It's in us. But if we're not careful, then the approval from people outweighs approval from you and life falls apart. Fear begins to take over and then we're no longer just acting in fear. It's like we're becoming fear. God, I believe there are people in church this morning, whether they're listening online or whether they're here live, I believe there are people here experiencing micro doses of hell. They're experiencing a disintegration of their personalities and this misery and this frustration that they can't seem to beat, that just cannot get it figured out. Why does life seem so frustrating? And this morning, God, it says that your word brings healing. You, God, can renew. Your word does not use that word on accident. You can renew our minds. You can push our reset button that says, God, allow me to live out of love and approval instead of rejection and fear. God, begin to heal our minds, begin to heal our hearts. Give us a heart that says, hey, I was in the sheep fields. And if I never left, fine. I don't need more to feel approved. God, give us a heart that pursues you and your approval and the healing that comes with that. Pray in Jesus' name, amen.